Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand under the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we get into today's show, I do have to plug our Patreon. I know everybody's sick of hearing it at this point, but it is how we keep the lights on. It's how we keep the show going. So if you do want to support us, it's Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. Starts from £3 a month, which works out less than a cup of coffee. You get a bonus episode every single week, which comes in the form of our Q&A episode that we do with our guest after the main show. So if you enjoy a show and you want to hear a little bit more of it, typically there is questions that I've missed, and there's a whole little section where you just get bumper information. The patrons always have some really good questions, and you get the whole back catalog when you sign up. So you don't just get it from when you sign up going forward, you get everything before. So at this point, there are years of bonus material to really get your teeth into. And if you can't support financially, obviously just a like, share, 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast, because then somebody else can find the podcast, and it really does help us kind of bump up those charts. But let's get into today's show. I'm really excited to this. Spooky season is here, so the topic fits well. I'm also joined by my lovely co-host and our in-house archaeologist after a couple of weeks off, Mags Havgar. Mags, nice to have you back.
Yes, hi. I'm very excited about today's episode because we are joined once again by Marianne Moen, head of the Department of Archaeology at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. And we are going to talk about human sacrifice today, Marianne.
Yes, we are.
Mm-hmm.
Exciting.
Okay. Yes, very exciting to be here. Always very happy to talk sacrifice.
Wonderful. Yes. How did you get into studying sacrifice, human sacrifice in particular? And
it's very particular.
Is there a big difference in studying sacrifice in general versus human sacrifice, or do they cross over?
Oh, they do cross over. Yeah, they really do cross over. Those are big questions. How did I get into it accidentally? Is the harsh truth of that. There was a postdoc on a project called Human Sacrifice and Value that I applied for and didn't get, but then there was another postdoc on the same project and I applied for it and got it. And I mean, most people who work with archaeology and anthropology and that sort of thing do have a vague interest in human sacrifice. So it's not like the topic was uninteresting, but it wasn't something that I had, spent any time thinking much about or working on before I started the project. So I was a bit of a sacrifice novice, and I joined this team, small team, but lovely team, international team of hardcore sacrifice enthusiasts. And we spent...
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Sorry. Made me laugh.
There is no way of keeping a straight face when you're talking about this, which is funny. We could get into all of that, but you can study sacrifice in many ways. Some people go very, very emotional about it, and focus on the horror and the stories of child sacrifice and all that. But I tend not to do that because I struggle to believe in a lot of the stories of sacrifice. I'm rambling now, but I'm a bad candidate for studying human sacrifice in that I'm not actually sure that it happened all that often.
Okay.
I like where we're going with this.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I do, right. So, I mean, we do have a lot of stories of sacrifice. And I think some of them are probably right, but bearing in mind this is because I'm now a little bit damaged from spending a lot of time with sacrifice enthusiasts. First of all, you have to define what you think a sacrifice is, and that's the first hurdle where many people fall. So if you go with the absolute technical definition, a sacrifice is a gift to a god.
Okay.
And if it isn't a gift to a god, it can't be a sacrifice. And so there are sacrifice scholars out there who will not, for example, accept that attendant sacrifices that we often, may possibly see evidence of in graves. They won't accept that that is a sacrifice because it wasn't made to a god. It was made on behalf of the dead person. And we'll get back to it. And it relates to Ibn Fadlan.
So when you say attendance, you mean somebody is killed to attend the main grave person, grave character, grave owner, person.
Occupant.
Occupant, probably a better word. There you go.
Yeah. So that's my first problem because the definition of sacrifice then becomes so narrow that if you believe that only gifts to gods are sacrifices, I think most ritual killings don't apply. And this is getting
Okay.
very nitty-gritty, but I have spent 2 years arguing with colleagues about this, so I still think it's interesting to talk about. I think humans have been ritually killed throughout the ages and in different places and imaginative ways. I think they still are, in many ways, by our own society and others. But I don't think many people were killed solely as a gift to a god.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But that's very interesting, that kind of that nuance between what is considered a sacrifice and
Yes.
what is kind of more technically a ritual killing
Yes.
of someone or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
So, the thing about human sacrifice is that if you ask your average sacrifice scholar, they will say that a human sacrifice is the biggest thing that you can give. And again, I think that is problematic because human doesn't necessarily mean person. So we're going to be talking about the Viking Age, obviously, which is my favorite time in the whole history and prehistory of humanity to talk about. But I don't think they actually sacrificed humans. Well, the people. I think they sacrificed human bodies, but I don't think they were people to them. And we know for a fact, well, we don't know for a fact, we know nothing for a fact, but we surmise about the Viking Age that, for instance, horses could have much more social value than slaves. So they sacrificed horses, we know that. And they also sacrificed people, we are fairly sure, but those people might not have been people. So you also need to define what
Okay.
is a sacrifice and what is a person. And I know I do this with everything I talk about, is add in qualifiers so that in the end we end up believing in nothing. But I think they are important things.
That's that's a really interesting point because in 2024 we would all say every human is
Mm,
or every person is a human and all
exactly.
lives are equal.
Yes.
Um,
Not
but
animals, though.
yeah, but I've never thought of it like that. Too, when we're talking about human sacrifice, we especially when we're talking about the Vikings, you have to put yourself back in their minds at the time, and
Yeah.
sometimes sometimes that's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't fit with our ideals today, but it's a point that I've never thought of, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will have never looked to the aspect of they didn't see slaves as humans. So is
No.
it classed as human sacrifice? And I think that's a really good point because obviously today, looking back, we're like, yeah, absolutely, they're humans, but you can't look at everything through the modern lens.
Yeah, and
No.
it comes back to what we were talking about, the episode you were also on about gender. It's like, did we, at what point do we just kind of assume that our modern assumptions about the past is
Mm,
also applicable to the past?
exactly. And I just don't think they are very often. Um, yeah, so I think many slaves in the Viking Age were not people, and killing them might not have mattered in the same way, might have been no more traumatic than killing a horse, which makes me sound horrible, but we do have to try and think
Mhm.
with very different lives in mind. Yeah.
But it's uncomfortable to think and say. But when you're talking about why a slave was taken and the use, it's
Yeah.
to do labor, it's to
Yeah.
do work, it's to
Yeah.
benefit to gain yourself without you having to do the hard labor. And that is the
Exactly.
cold hard fact of it. And that is unfortunately equal to like any type of beast that they would have had. And
Mm.
it's not nice to say or think about, but it's the cold reality of it. So you have to talk about it to be able to have these conversations. And that is probably how they were seen.
Yeah, and also I think it's possible to think two things at once, right? Where you can, on one hand, um, from the modern perspective, I would consider any human body to be a person. So
Mm.
to me, this seems horrible and horrific, but at the
Yeah.
same time, I acknowledge that at that point in time, such bodies were not considered to be persons, and they
Mhm.
therefore did not have my perspective on that this was a horrible thing to do.
Yeah, I think it
Mhm.
made perfect rational sense. I mean, and you do have to accept that, yeah, as long as it made sense within their belief system, then we can sort of see it as a rational act, even though it is abhorrent to modern minds. But I think, it might not have applied to all slaves. The source is very conflicting when it comes to like the human or not status of slaves in the Viking Age. But we do have like fairly solid evidence in form of law codes, for instance, that refer to slaves and people. So it does seem to have
Okay.
been a differentiation there between what kind of category of human was a person.
Hmm. Okay, so that's completely split everything up to what is and is
Yeah.
not human sacrifice.
And
Because
what is a sacrifice? What is a human? Yes.
yeah, because I would have thought this was relatively straightforward.
Yeah,
Obviously,
no, but nothing is
Never
straightforward.
is.
I should have
Not
learned
when
by
you're talking
now.
to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, I should have learned by now. Nothing to do with this whole era is straightforward.
Ah,
Um, okay, so I think my definition of a sacrifice would be anybody, especially like in terms of human sacrifice, any human that their life is given for another purpose. So it
yes.
wouldn't have to be necessarily for a god, but in the case of where it's like an attendance sacrifice, I would still class that as a sacrifice because it's a life being sacrificed to go to the next life with their what I would assume would be their owner, maybe, but maybe we don't even know that.
Mm. Yeah, so no, I agree. I don't like the traditional definition of sacrifice. I think it's too narrow, and I also think it's inherently Christian. And we need to stop thinking in those terms if we're going to try and understand other ways of being. So, sacrifice studies, to my mind, is massively complicated by the fact that we all expect Christian logics to apply to cultures that are nothing like them. So, yes, I think we can talk about sacrifice as any sort of ritual killing of another person. And I think a lot of the time those were fairly transactional, and maybe weren't, motivated um, by anything much other than wanting to gain something.
Mhm.
But actually, it's interesting what you said about slave sacrifices there, because my whole theory, and I have published a paper on this, a feminist rereading of Ibn Fadlan, would you guess? And my reading.
Amazing.
I know, what a surprise. My take on it is that there is some evidence that as a slave, being sacrificed might have been a good thing. So
Okay.
there are sources, a source that talks about a slave. It's a saga source. So it talks about a slave that volunteers to be a human sacrifice when his master dies, because that way he would go into a better afterlife. He would go to Odin, basically.
Okay. Okay. I want to put a pin in that.
Yeah.
Because I want to put a pin in that. I want to, if we could, because I imagine there's a lot less. You touched on it before, that there are less sources or less evidence for the traditional description of sacrifice.
Yeah.
So sacrificing a human to a god.
Yeah.
Like, so we're going to sacrifice me because we want there to be a fruitful summer, or do we see that? Is that a thing?
Yes, we do, but not much. So there are a few sources that indicate that sort of thing, but they are usually written by Christian outsiders. So Adam of Bremen talks about the Blut, Uppsala. And that would be one of the more famous sources. So, I mean, there are several issues with that source in many ways, and we won't delve into that here. But he talks about a massive Blut that happened, was it every 9 years at Uppsala, and they sacrificed 9 of every living being, including humans, and that was to the gods as such. So you do have that, but
Is that the year of Aun? Is that the same
Can
thing?
I just put an ad, like just a little thing there about
yeah,
that source?
yeah.
I at Mingar Talks a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of seeing in Bolton give a talk where he absolutely destroyed Adam of Bremen's.
I don't like Adam of Bremen. I mean, there are
Which
so much.
if he ever publishes that talk, I'm gonna link it because that was amazing. He basically went on to say that Adam of Bremen was likely just making shit up, and he had a grudge against people from what we would today call Denmark, and nothing adds up.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty much on that page as well. I think Adam Bremen is severely overused. He never went to any of the places that he's describing. It's basically a mate told a mate of mine that in Uppsala they do this crazy shit.
Oh
So yes,
wow,
there are
okay.
issues. He
See,
also
I've I've done this podcast for 230 odd episodes and never. I've not read it myself because obviously I'm a lazy bitch. I just like everyone to
well,
come on here and tell me about it.
uh,
But I've never heard it said like that or that put like that he's never visited the places. It's just like been passed
it's
down.
secondhand, yeah, second.
Same as Tustus.
Yeah,
Um,
but it is referenced so many times of like,
yes, it
oh,
is. It really
this
is.
this because obviously I guess we don't have that many sources, and it's
No, we
always
don't.
one that's pulled up.
Always. Many people love Adam of Bremen. I personally hesitate to take as gospel anything written by a man who also described a tribe of people who had no necks but had their heads in the middle of their chest, and also noted that in the very north of Norway, the women were all covered in hair. Adam of Bremen also wrote that, and yet we don't read references to that very often. He
No.
was clearly not reliable. No.
Mhm.
But what's interesting is that Adam of Bremen plagiarized the good old Titmar of Merseburg, who writes exactly the same thing about Leida, a good 50 years before Adam of Bremen. He writes about how they gather for a big bloat every few years, and then they sacrifice 99 humans with the same amount of various animals, including horses and dogs. So there is potentially evidence that this was lifted out of Titmar's writings, which is a great name, by the way.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Hmm.
Imagine, yeah,
I keep just thinking ocean of tits when I hear something.
I know. I mean, there is nothing that is what springs to mind.
imagine just writing because it seems like he wrote like a lot of shit and like
You
just just
did.
just picked a lot of stuff and made a lot of stuff up, but that's the one that survived for us today. And
Yeah.
like imagine the chance of that. That's the one we get. And we're like, fuck, we gotta go on this. And then so many people just read it and take it as it is, or do, or like me. I think that's part of the issue with all of this is that so many people will just hear it referenced. The you have again it's so difficult to be interested in all of this stuff and be accurate because it is so complicated and just not straightforward that you get bits pulled from all over that's not true that might be true little bits. So if you have a basic interest in this, you kind of just have to do your best, and you just see these quotes from Adam of Bremen or from wherever and you don't know the background, and then
No.
it just breathes its life into it and it gets passed on to the next person, and by the time it's a few years down the line, it's taken to be fact.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And that's one of the big problems in working age studies, if you ask me. Things snowball, they get referenced somewhere by somebody who likes Adam or Bremen, because lots of people do. I do not. And you can sort of divide Viking scholars into the camps of those who like Adam or Bremen and those who really do not. But then again, I also think that it's one of those sources where things are cherry picked, because a lot of the stuff he writes is clearly just rubbish. So, you know.
It's almost like using you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of someone using Elon Musk's tweets to back up what they're saying is what it reminds me of. And then they completely disregard all the other shit he said
Yeah.
online. If Elon Musk ever listens to this, I apologize, dude, but get your act together. But in order to get us back on track, I wanted to ask, so before we get into more depth,
Hmm.
what evidence, and here I mean evidence with a loose definition,
Hmm.
do we have of human sacrifice / ritual killing
Very
in this
good.
time period?
That's a very good and very well qualified question. So I won't go off on another tangent. We have quite a bit. We have saga references. A couple of them I think I've mentioned already. There are more. We have Adam and Titmar. Let's have a look. What else do we have? We also have Ibn Fadlan, which is far and away the best source
mhm.
for human sacrifice in the Viking Age, seeing as it was an eyewitness account of a human sacrifice in that. Ibn Fadlan's account we can talk more about in a bit, but it has a section that describes an attendant sacrifice connected to the burial of a Viking chief. We also have Some archaeological evidence, but that's where it gets really shaky because, you know, in archaeology, you can never really say that you can never really say with any certainty what it is you're looking at because we rely on having to interpret the material that we find in the ground. And so, you know, the stories we tell are very often more related to our own understandings and frames of reference than they might have been about the past. But having
Get that on a t-shirt.
too right. But having said that,
I was just quickly to bring an example up. Could that be a case with the Oseberg ship? I imagine some people would say it's, you know, with being two women, one's a little bit young or quite a bit younger.
Yeah.
I guess there must be a camp of people who said that it's an attendant sacrifice.
Oh God, yes. Yes, this was a recurring conversation on the project I was on, where everybody else could not understand why I refused to write about Ulsberg as a sacrifice. I just don't think Ulsberg is a sacrifice. It is not a good candidate for that kind of grave. Yes, it has two women in it, and that's not unheard of. There are several other double female burials found throughout the Viking realm. There is nothing to indicate that one of them was killed. There's nothing to indicate that either of them led lives that were anything but privileged. And if you look at the material found in the graves and the osteology, it looks like both of them were massively privileged. So the younger person, younger woman, had marks on her teeth from having used a toothpick, for instance, which is not something that I think a slave would have. Whilst the older person, the older woman had, you know, tailor-made shoes to deal with her arthritis, that kind of thing. So I don't think the slave sacrifice fits at all on Ulsberg. But it does fit on certain other graves, several other graves.
Yeah, I also want to just add a caveat when it comes to Ulsberg, in that I think the reason why that interpretation sticks is because it was the preliminary original interpretation of the burial in 1904.
Okay.
Exactly.
And having read those references, which are in many cases extremely good, but when it comes to that specific interpretation, the way I read it, it is extremely sloppy in the sense that there are two women here. Weird.
Yeah,
first of all,
don't know what to do with
in
that.
1904, very weird.
Oh,
Two women. Why?
Yeah. Why
So,
ladies are cool.
yeah. And then they pretty much from there just immediately go off of, well, one of them has to be a sacrifice.
Exactly.
Because why else would they be in the burial? And then they argue which one of them it is. And that interpretation stuck so heavily to the burial that when these bodies were reinterred in 48 or 47, the younger woman was put in a bag at the feet of the older woman.
Oh my God, I did not know that. That's fantastic.
Wrote a paper about it.
Crikey.
Yeah. So that's just to put on that. So there's no material evidence.
There is none.
Thinking or kind of shows that this is a human sacrifice case, but it is a magnificent example of the way that modern interpretations or assumptions influence how we treat older material. But
sorry, just quickly, and it's a little bit off topic, I guess. Is there a theory as to why you would have two women in a grave if it wasn't? Because again, probably my very unqualified brain. Because when I look at it, I would just go, that kind of makes sense. Like the older one would be maybe a queen, and then the younger one is sacrificed and 10 sacrifice to go with, and that's kind of just how I would very rudimentary look at it and go, yeah.
But can I challenge you in asking you, isn't that what you've been taught to expect?
Probably. Yeah, probably.
There are many theories, many theories. Some of them are pretty bonkers, to use the correct academic terminology. Some of them are more straightforward. Some of them are good. About 90% of them all have in common that they try and divert attention away from two women buried in an obvious power and status symbol. Because until Ulsberg, and even still, actually, most ship mounds are talked about as the monuments from rulers or built over rulers, but Ulsberg tends to fall outside of those stories. Which is interesting. I think any number of potential explanations could be feasible. They could have been partners, they could have been close collaborators, they could have shared power between them, for instance. We don't know if they were related because the only DNA test that was done on them was botched, so Don't know anything much from that. Um, yeah,
But
other
would
theories.
would there not be, if they were, let's say, partners, or related, what would be the reason of them being to get like dying at the same time?
Well,
That would be the kind of thing that I would like,
they didn't
unless one
necessarily
was
die at the same time, though, because the burial took quite some time to build. We know that it was constructed over a matter of months.
okay.
So it didn't necessarily have to be at the same time. There are also quite a lot of multiple burials across the Viking sphere of influence. Some with two, some with three, some with four bodies in them. And we very rarely have a good grip on the relationship in like between the people found in a grave. But also I guess it's I think if you judge from the basis of the grave goods, then you are looking at two very powerful, wealthy women. And that's the best thing I can say about
Okay.
it.
Okay. Right. Let's get back to human
Yes.
So
sacrifice.
what about burials where there, like, are there any
Yeah,
burials or
there are
physical
some
material?
much better ones. So you got the lovely elk man at Birka. He's a good one. Uh, it's called the elk man because there's an elk antler in the grave. So it's a chamber grave, if I remember correctly. It contains the body of a relatively old man with quite impressive grave goods, and then on top of that, there is sort of the body of a younger man thrown in. And it isn't a multiple grave in the terms that it doesn't have multiple like double grave goods. So what
Oh, okay.
what makes Ulceberg a bad candidate for the human sacrifice bit is that it seems to have grave goods belonging to both people. And I think if graves have things belonging to clearly want more occupants, then I don't think a slave sacrifice is a good explanation. But the Elkman does not have that. It's just a body
Okay.
thrown into what looks like a single male grave.
Meaning that the extra body is part of the grave
The grave
goods.
goods. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah. That's a good one. There's also a couple of ones in Denmark. There's one at Leida. That's a double male one. So there's a male burial, relatively straightforward, weapons and fairly decent grave goods. And then about half a meter above him is the prone and decapitated body of another man with no grave goods. So that's another good one. There's a few more like that.
Was decapitation common? Because I feel like I don't
Oh.
remember hearing of it too often.
Um, no, I don't think it was very common, at least not judging from the graves that we do have. There's also
Decapitation of animals, however.
very common.
Yeah. The only decapitation I can think of is where, oh, he's in a saga where someone gets their heads cut off and then shoved up their ass. Is that in a
Might
saga?
be a saga.
Is that a saga? I remember Mateus talking about this once. I've not just made this up. I hope that someone has their heads
It's
cut off and then,
outside my
or like it's placed between it's placed between the legs, not actually like shoved up there, but like placed between the legs is like a type of disrespect. Would I?
crikey.
Would I?
Hmm.
Yeah, Draugr. I'm sure that's it.
That reminds me of something I heard Leszek say once.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely remember it being mentioned on here at some point. I don't feel like I've just made that up, but
No,
yeah,
no, no, I believe you.
it's
It sounds
the
like a very specific thing to make up.
it's just as soon as you mentioned decapitation though, that made me it kind of triggered a little alarm bell. I was like, oh, I don't remember hearing that being a method of death very often, or like something that's been mentioned on here often.
No, 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 it's not something. No, I don't think so. But you do find it in some of these graves. The potential human sacrifice ones. There's
Okay.
also three interesting graves at Kaupang in Norway that nobody talks about, which I don't understand why, because I think they're the best slave sacrifice candidates that we do have. So the wealthiest cemetery at Kaupang, which is a flat grave cemetery, all the graves there are absolutely mental. Again,
Black
using
grave, does that mean that it doesn't have a mound on top?
that is exactly what it means. Yes, sorry.
Cool.
Yes, they do have stone packings though, so they were marked. But all the graves there are completely mental, so they are multiple burials, many of them, 4 to 5 people in the burial, absolute masses of grave goods, that sort of thing. But in between all of these fabulous, many of them boat burial, many of them multiple, all of them wealthy graves, there are 3 individuals buried with nothing.
Huh.
Um, yeah, and it just
By
makes
themselves?
yes, in separate graves,
Hmm.
which is really
Huh.
interesting. And there's
Yeah.
also on that same cemetery a horse burial, and the horse has grave goods, and these three humans do not.
Well, well, well.
I know the plot thickens.
Because that, like, from just speaking, like, from, I mean, my overview of all of our material remains from the Viking Age is hazy at best because there's just so much of it
So
and
much
it's
of it, yeah.
weird.
Yes.
But a burial with a single person without any grave goods,
It,
that's the
it,
type of burial we don't really ever find, is it?
exactly. It's so
Huh.
rare.
Mm.
And I think we wouldn't have found them if it hadn't been for the fact that they are on that cemetery. Um,
Because the material remains is usually what gives us a clue as to there's a grave
and
here.
absolutely. I mean, most of our burials have no skeletal remains, but we think it's a grave because it has, a brooch and a sword on it.
Okay, so in uh I might be I might be getting a bit technical here, but just to play the devil's advocate for a
Mm,
second, since we
mm.
know this is Kaupang, so this is, I mean, it would be very, very, very early in that case, but why would you think that they are good candidates for human sacrifice versus being Christian burials?
That's a good question. They could be Christian burials, but they're just not elaborate in any way. There's no grave
Okay.
container, no coffins. I believe one of them is missing a limb. Um, they just don't seem like any care was taken over them.
Mhm.
They're sort of
Is it
Hmm.
is it common that with an attendance based sacrifice that they
mm,
would not be with the person I guess they were meant to attend? Because
no,
it sounds like that these are buried in their own grave
yeah, they
separate.
are. Yeah,
Whereas I feel like if it was an attendance one, they would want them to be kind of
in the
with
grave.
them. Yeah, so
Yeah,
it goes with them to the afterlife.
you would think so, wouldn't you? So I don't think there are attendant sacrifices as such. It
Yeah,
might be
unless maybe
some-
they died digging the graves and then just thrown
Possible.
in,
Yeah,
or
or
like.
possible it was like a cemetery-wide ritual.
Hmm.
Yeah. Because also the thing is, like, if they just kind of died and, like, oh shit, we need to bury them, then considering that, correct me if I'm wrong here, Marianne, but considering that Kaupang, that specific burial ground is fairly large, no?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So then having only three of those single graves is a relatively small number.
Yeah,
Hmm. You're right. We should talk about these.
yeah, we would.
I'm my head is just going. Bzzz.
Having said that, I might not write another paper on human sacrifice. I am
Well, you don't have to. We're passing the ball on here.
excellent.
Just letting people know. PSA
Somebody should
announcement.
do something.
Someone, for God's sake, or multiple deities, whoever, or none,
Exactly.
do
Yes.
something.
Would somebody please think of the potential slave sacrifices?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, before we get on to like attendance ones, do we have any that are kind of just going back right to the start of this is we're going to sacrifice this person to get like X result? Are there any that we know for like for certain that is what? Because I don't know. This could be my very basic understanding of other mythologies from around the world, but I always think of like South American type mythologies being very kind of human sacrifice to get a result. And then I think of like Egyptian burials to be more, we're going to give these goods to go with. And that could just be because that's all I learned when I was at school. And that could be like completely wrong. But yeah, do we see that kind of like, we're going to sacrifice this person to get this result?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we say evidence, but that's a loose definition. We do have saga references to that happening.
Okay.
Really, really interesting ones is in Flateyjarbók book where Earl Håkon sacrificed his youngest son ahead of the eve on the eve of a big battle to the deity known as Turged Holgabrud, which we don't know anything much about. Um, This is referenced twice somewhere else as well. And the other reference talks about how Torgeir Hårgaard then appeared in the battle and helped him win. So it did
Huh.
work.
Okay.
But
So
that's,
the ends justified the means, apparently.
yeah, apparently.
Okay.
Hmm.
When you say son, how old was his son? Young. Well,
Yeah.
I wanted to bring that up because
Sounds very biblical.
isn't
Yeah.
that like a isn't that quite a is that quite a common thing? Well, I don't know whether it's child sacrifice or at least infanticide. Is
Yeah,
that's the right word,
infanticide
right?
is fairly common. Infanticide is just a relatively standard response to lack of birth control and food poverty type thing. I think most prehistoric societies we have to assume practiced infanticide, but you also have
We
to.
practiced infanticide until very recently.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a rational response to not being able to potentially feed and bring up your child. I'm talking like I think this is okay. Obviously, I don't, but I also think that we paint it as something much worse than people thought of it back then. Um, and again, it was a passive form of infanticide. It would be leaving your child out, hoping that some kind stranger would find it, and if not, that it would die of the exposure. But there's also nothing much to say that children that young were considered people either. So we
Okay.
really don't necessarily think that we should recoil in horror at something that has been very common throughout human history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
regardless of geographical place or time.
Yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
if you ask Christian fundamentalists, they would say that abortion is infanticide. So it's all a
Mm-hmm.
question of definition, isn't it? I
Mm-hmm.
don't think children, young infants were considered people. So I just don't think that infanticide as such was a terrible thing.
Do we see that any sacrifice when it comes to young children, or do they? Because I guess the question that keeps coming up in my head that I was going to leave, but it kind of keeps popping up in a sense of you mentioned before of how slaves might not be considered human, and that makes sense in a sense of a you're gonna send a slave with somebody, so
Mm,
they're gonna be beneficial for you in the afterlife.
mm,
But when it comes to a sacrifice for for a means, we're gonna sacrifice this person to get this. Does the value of the person being sacrificed help what you're asking for? So if you sacrifice a slave, would that be deemed less and you're less likely to get, glory in battle
mm.
versus if you sacrifice somebody who was maybe a good warrior? And it's like
Yeah,
that's a better offering to the god. So you're going to get more likely to
that's
get the
a
outcome you want. Yeah. Do we
yeah.
do we see that? And I guess that kind of goes into that child thing of if it's a child, would the gods be just like, it's just a kid. I don't want that. I want like give me
Yeah.
something meaty.
You know, like, I think you're onto something there. And again, they're saga references. They're fairly unreliable, but we do have some evidence of that. And before I forget, there's a really interesting 2011 paper by Margrethe that talks about child sacrifice as cheating the gods. And I think there is something in that. I think they were possibly of less value, but obviously the son of an earl would be of more value. So
Yeah.
it's all a question of definition, isn't it? Right. So there is a story of Olav Tryggvason. As he was trying to bring Christianity to Norway, he met resistance up in Trøndelag because they were not keen on Jesus back then. Don't know what they're like now, to be honest. Anyway,
Trender strike again.
anyway, as he was doing that, he met resistance in the local farmers, and they were like, you know what, if you come and do a blot with us, then well, we will convert. And Olav Tryggvason went, yeah, sure, I'll do a blot with you, but I don't want to blot with horses, nor do I want to blot with slaves. I want to blot with human sacrifices and valuable ones. So we will get your best chieftains and we'll sacrifice them. And then all the local farmers were like, oh, do you know what? We'll actually just go Christian instead. So
Sneaky
yeah.
bugger.
Mm-hmm.
I know. So that does speak to that there were levels of value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does make sense that
Yeah. I
uh,
mean, I don't think it's a true story, but I think that what these things tell us is that sacrifice was a thing and that it had sort of a chain of different values and that you could sacrifice more or less depending on what you wanted. But it does make sacrifice very transactional, which I think it is. I think a sacrifice usually is to get something, to get a better life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it would, because I've always thought of this when it comes to any burial, particularly, the shipwreckers, where they're sacrificing a ship,
Yeah.
which is a great commodity, and then horses,
Mm.
cows, dogs, all these things that are useful. There has to be some gain to it to give all
Yes.
that away.
It comes back to what I was saying, is that my problem with sacrifice studies is they tend to be very Christianized in their thinking. And what we then fundamentally, I think, do wrong when we try and apply that sort of mindset to the Viking Age is that they had no sort of similar relationship with their gods as Christians do to their God. So Christians, Christianity is all about devotion. It's all about worship. Whereas I think the Old Norse gods were rather more pragmatic and it was all about transactions. And so I think if you try and view it that way, things make sense in a different way. I don't think you were required to worship Odin and Freya. I just think you were required to acknowledge and pay them some respect.
Mm-hmm.
It's like your taxes. It's like you don't have to like them, but you
No,
still have
you
to
just have
pay
to
them.
pay them. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Old Norse gods, like
Yeah.
taxes.
And it also, that's like, from that point of view, it's also interesting with something that you said earlier when it comes to we don't really know what the value of a slave necessarily was, and that they probably weren't considered human in the way that we considered human bodies to be a person. Then these human bodies were not necessarily considered to be people at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you mentioned that they might even have been deemed less valuable than horses.
Mm-hmm.
And then an interesting point, I have no evidence for this. This is just me jumping off of things we've talked about. But an interesting point then with perhaps the lack of seeing like physical material evidence of human sacrifice is whether or not, why would you do it if, like, why would you throw just garbage into a burial in order to honor it? If there was no value in that, let's call it, I want to make sure people understand, I'm not calling people things, but from that mindset, they could be considered things. Perhaps.
But I think,
would it be any point? But whereas we do see a lot of burials with horses in them.
There are many more attendant horses than attendant people. Yeah.
So again, I don't have any evidence for this, haven't studied it, but it was an interesting thought.
It is a really interesting thought.
I think it depends on how you define value as well.
Yeah,
I think
100%.
we probably
Good point.
Probably need to differentiate between value, because a slave would have immense value to their owner in a sense of that they stop them doing work, that they can get, plow the fields faster or build the homestead quicker or whatever you need to do. It has incredible value in that sense, but they don't have value in a sense that they're not on equal standing culturally or class, in a class system. So there is the value there. It's just that when it comes to being what they're, I don't know the best word to use, maybe what they're worth or how they're viewed by society, because they have like some work value. It's just
I
that
think
it's
that's
not,
a very
not an
that's
equality
really
value when it comes to. So again, you would be, if you were to sacrifice a slave, you now have to do that work yourself.
Yeah.
So yes, maybe they don't have the same quote unquote like human value, but there is this thing, oh well, now I have to do the jobs that they did. So there is some value to them.
Oh, 100%.
Definitely, but value is a very broad term. And we do have reason to believe that slaves were occasionally sacrificed as well as attendants. So yeah.
Yeah. And I guess for that, it's a case that the value is that they're going to help the person in the next life, which shows some belief of, in the next life, you need earthly possessions with you to help you
Definitely.
on your journey.
More pragmatic approach to earthly pleasures and goods the Vikings had than later Christianity.
Yeah, and you can take them with you.
Yeah, and you would take all your best things with you, your favorite slave and your bestest ship and all your favorite horses, and in the case of the Gokstar man, your favorite peacocks.
Yeah, but it is.
I mean, if I had peacocks,
I would totes take them with me. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure,
oh,
yeah.
sure. But it is this thing of that it probably is from Christianity. And I think a lot of us don't think of it so much now that we spend our whole lives collecting stuff.
yeah.
Probably more now than any other time in history. We just collect
So
stuff.
much
And a
stuff.
lot of it's shit that we don't need, but we just collect stuff. But we
Yeah.
have this idea that you can't take it with you. Like that's how many times do people hear that? Like spend your
Oh,
money,
God,
you
yeah.
can't take it
No,
with
you
you, or
can't
your
take it
items,
with
you
you.
can't
No,
take it
well,
with
maybe you
you.
can actually.
And it is that idea that, we have this thought of that you can't take anything with you, and it probably is very Christian. Whereas if you believe that you can take it with you and have all your nice stuff in the afterlife, well, why not?
Yeah.
It's a nice
I'd
thought. I'd love to have my stuff.
Oh, God, yeah, I love my stuff.
Yeah,
I've got so much
I've
stuff.
spent a lot of time collecting it and a lot of effort and
All the
money.
stuff.
All the
Uh,
things.
All the things. All
all
the
right,
things. Literally all the things.
let's get into Ibn Fadlan before
Yeah.
we
Even
run
that.
out of time, because obviously
Yeah.
this is the major one. This is the one that everybody quotes, the one that
Yes.
I know of, that I've heard in passing on
Everybody
here.
loves Ibn Fadlan.
So where do you want to give a quick maybe
I certainly do.
overview
Um,
of what it is?
Yeah, so Ibn Fadlan is a one of a kind. It's basically the unicorn of Viking Age studies in the sense that it is an eyewitness account. So Ibn Fadlan was a traveler, potentially diplomat, and he traveled around in Eastern Europe, up the Volga, and he met various people there. But the bit that most people are interested in is his description of his meetings with the Rus. So that would be Swedish Vikings, most likely. He described lots of interesting things about them, but the most famous passage is the bit about the burial. So Ibn Fadlan writes, sorry, the source is also from 921, roughly speaking,
Okay.
just for context. So Ibn Fadlan was traveling up the Volga and he met a group of Rus, and they told him that if he took a little detour, he would see a spectacle well worth seeing, which was the burial of a Viking chieftain or a chieftain of the Rus who had recently died. So
Do we know who that was, or do we know
no, we
where
don't.
that burial is? Is there
No.
Just classifying these people even as Vikings is an assumption to begin with.
Yes. And there are also source critical problems with Ibn Fadlan, although nothing near what we got with Adam of Bremen. Anyway, so Ibn Fadlan took his trusty translator with him and went down. And that's one of the source critical problems, is that he did not speak the language. So everything that we have is translated. And then it is translated again, because what a lot of people forget is that Ibn Fadlan wrote for an audience. He wrote specifically for an Arab-speaking, well-educated audience who expected to be informed but also entertained by his stories.
okay?
Bearing that in mind. But he was very entertained by this spectacle of the burial. So he came down there and then he describes an elaborate ritual of how the dead man was put in a temporary grave while they sorted out all his possessions and made ready the funeral. He describes this master of ceremonies, I suppose you could call her, the angel of death. That's Ibn Fadlan's word for her, not a Rus word as far as we know, but we don't really know. She was an old woman. Ibn Fadlan describes her as fat and ugly, I think, and frightening. But she was in
How
charge.
lovely of him.
I know, it's charming, isn't it? She takes charge of the ceremony. And there's loads of really interesting details as well. So he writes that when a man dies, they divide his fortune into three. 1/3 is for his family, 1/3 is to prepare the feast and the funeral, and 1/3 to make the cloth and textiles that he's buried with. So that's actually really interesting because it shows how important textiles were. But anyway, sorry, detouring again.
But it also shows, I guess, how
Interesting caveat.
they paid for themselves. It wasn't, because I always assumed that there was a chief, they maybe collectively the group would have paid for it, but I guess he pays for it.
No, he pays for himself. So whilst the body is contained in this temporary grave for 10 days, they prep the funeral, they pull a ship onto land, they gather all the grave goods, and they basically have a massive 10-day piss up.
Nice.
With
Oh
the
yeah, stag do for death.
Nice.
toast.
That's how I want to go.
Yeah. But also we're coming to the sacrifice bit. The angel of death, shortly after the man has died, gathers all his slaves, slave girls and boys, and asks them which of you will die with him. And then a young girl steps up and volunteers. And for
So
the 10 days.
I guess that kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
This account of it being a good thing.
I think it was a good thing. I've written a paper about this, so I
Mhm.
have to defend it. But I also think that life as a young slave girl in the hands of the Rus was probably no party whatsoever.
It was probably quite similar as to what's to come.
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah,
I
quite similar to
guess.
what's to come. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Also, trigger warning, people. This is gonna get dark real quick from our modern.
yeah, no, the rest of
Nice.
Urban Flatland is really, really unpleasant in any way, unless you, as I do, see this as an active choice and an assertion of agency. So I think that by volunteering to die, this girl knew that she would now be moved artificially into the status of wife, because that was what happened. So she was now treated as the dead man's wife. So she was assigned slave girls of her own. She was covered with jewelry. She was given as much booze as she wanted to drink. She spent her days singing, drinking, and having sex with the dead man's best friends, basically.
Mhm. Now,
Yeah.
when you say, because obviously there's two camps, isn't there? There is one where
Right.
she's very, very willing and she's drinking and happy and having, having sex with his friends or his warriors,
Cohorts.
however you want to put it. And the other one is that I guess the alcohol is kind of to ease
Numbing her.
what would be effectively like the raping of her
Yeah.
by multiple. So there is. I've heard both.
Yeah, both
Views.
are totally legitimate interpretations. I would never try and minimize sexual violence in any way, but if you go by the source, she is described as very happy during those
Okay,
days.
but also when you think about a life of a slave, and
Yeah.
if you get that opportunity to, because where we think about life very linear as it's just from when we're born to when we die, and then if you believe in heaven, you believe in heaven. Some people believe that when we die, that's it, it's all over. Whereas in this case, we're talking about people that believed there was something after, and it probably was a lot longer than what came before. So if you get the opportunity to leave slavedom, and become the wife of a chieftain and have this amazing life after, then you've got to take the opportunity when it presents itself.
That's exactly my argument. I just think it made sense. It's not that long ago that people believed in heaven and hell. I mean, some people still do, I'm sure. This was very much a tangible part of their world, I think. And yeah, you could live out your miserable life in slavery, probably being sexually violated on a regular basis anyway. Or you could take a gamble, die in a fairly unpleasant way, and then have a better afterlife, which was, after all, almost forever.
Yeah.
So,
And you could even make an argument that a lot of people probably that were in slavery wanted to die anyway. So
yeah.
it could even be, even if it wasn't for the belief that you were going to become the chieftain's wife and have a lovely happily ever after, it was also an almost kind of choice of suicide to be able to get out of what was probably a miserable existence.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And it brings it back to that saga reference that I was talking about earlier as well, where we have a source that cites a slave being allowed to die with their master so that they could go to Valhalla after. So I do think there is something in that. But anyway, so all this culminates and the ship is brought up on land, lots of animals are sacrificed, lots of rituals are done, and then the slave girl is, at this stage, I think we can use the word rape, serially raped in the grave chamber on the ship. And she is then killed by the angel of death, and the ship is set alight. It burns down to ashes, and they raise a mound over it. So it's interesting in many ways, and it is very interesting in that it describes what we see in the archaeology in terms of ship burials. You know, the grave goods, the rituals, the mound, all of those things. It does indicate a certain level of truth to what's described.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It is visceral, to say the least. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Marianne, but isn't she killed during one of the rape episodes?
No, it's
No, okay. Well, then I
it's
misremembered. My bad.
killed by being simultaneously strangled and stabbed.
Right, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not so nice at all. But again, they had a very different relationship with life and death than we do.
Oh, sure. Like, I'm not saying that it was bad at the time. I'm just saying from my point of view,
It's horrible. Yeah.
it's a bit like I can just the dun from Law and Order is just going on repeat. I mean, I wouldn't think it was nice, but at the same time, I can't speak for her because I do think it's really cool because, like, as we said earlier, not defending or excusing
No.
sexual violence or
Never.
or abuse in any kind of way, but it also is very interesting to take the point of view of the agency
Yeah.
of the slave, because there is also a point to be made of in modern interpretations, when someone is defined as a slave, whether it be through written sources or material evidence, to automatically, perhaps unconsciously, write off their agency.
Yeah.
That they don't have any power to
Mhm.
have a say about their own existence.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. And it's exactly my point is that because the world denied them agency doesn't mean that they had no agency, because it's about how
Exactly.
you define yourself.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point that
Yeah.
it's a tough one, isn't it? Because there could be so many reasons as to, and it could be, it could be a case that she was forced into this and that it was just a kind of thing like we're just going to pick one of the slaves and off you go, you're going with them. But it also, you can very quite easily see that it could have been a choice thing, and you could and you could put yourself in that position if you take yourself out of the modern view, put yourself in that place and go, you can see why she would choose to go with this, believe in what they
Yeah.
believe and the life she had. So you can see why, why that is. You mentioned before that Ibn Fadlan was told, if you want to see a spectacle, go and
Go and check this out, mate.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything to that? As in that they knew that it was a little bit different or weird or unusual? Because if they've said to him, like, if you want to see something, go look at this, that would kind of assume that they understand that it's not the normal, or they're putting on a show.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've never thought of it before.
I would think rather that perhaps instead of them being like, oh, this is unusual, well, I mean, this would still be unusual, but more in the sense that, hey, someone of that high a standing doesn't really necessarily die all that often. So
Yeah.
we're going to make a big ass kind of deal out of this funeral.
That's how I always read it, yeah. But it is a very interesting thought.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah. Quickly, I normally leave questions to the Q&A, but Claire Muller, who does the story time episodes with us, quickly, she asked, am I right in thinking that the people entrusted with doing sacrificial killing in this manner would have done a pretty clean, quick job? Someone doing a documentary on an English bogman said, while horrible, it showed an extremely precise technique. So I guess that goes back to this idea that she was strangled and stabbed.
And stabbed multiple times.
Is it a case of that? To us, that's where, like, yeah, that sounds horrible, but maybe it's a case of it's kind of done as quickly and as humanely as possible, because they didn't have the same understanding of the human body, I guess, as we did.
Pretty good, I think. That's a really, really interesting thought. It sort of depends who you ask, I think, in that. So there's the overkill thing, that some of the bog bodies, for instance, are killed in so many ways that it looks like it was a very elaborate and deliberate way of inflicting multiple forms of pain. So you could argue that, but you could also argue the other way, that it was to ensure a quick death. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I think in this case the angel of death is described as somebody who leads these ceremonies, so she would probably be competent in those ways.
Because I guess, as cruel as it sounds, for there to be purposeful suffering, I assume there would have to be a reason. It doesn't seem like these things are done just
For the torture of it?
Yeah, willy nilly. Like
No.
if there was if it's an exchange in a sense of that she's just going to go with the chieftain into the afterlife, then it would be I guess all that really needs to happen is that she dies, and then she will go. If you were to cause any undue suffering, there would have to be some sort of maybe reason for that.
Yeah, I think so. But I think also there's a violence aspect that we often forget, in that if you wanted to go to Valhalla, you had to die in battle. And I think that explains some of the death rituals we see where people clearly haven't died in battle, but there are aspects of violence in the funerary rites to sort of reenact, to maybe give you a free pass, even though you don't technically qualify.
Interesting. That's a very cool thought. I haven't thought about that before.
Well, I'm very, very pleased with that one. Yeah.
Yeah, you should be. I like that a lot. I think that's a very interesting thought.
I think it applies to a lot of the things that we see. Even you can even use it to argue for like where the spears are thrown into burials and that sort of thing. Yeah, I think.
But that being said, both dying in battle, just bear with me here, dying in battle / and or ritual killing or sacrifice does not necessarily have to imply a vast amount of pain.
No, it doesn't.
It's not synonymous.
No, it isn't.
Can be. Doesn't have to be.
Yeah, no, but it really doesn't have to be.
I think,
and there's nothing in Ibn Fadlan to suggest that that the death was long and drawn out. So
but
yeah,
I think that we probably have quite a Hollywood view of a battle with swords and shields in a field. I think it would be pretty horrific, and there would be a lot of bits hanging off, and people wouldn't die quickly, and it would be a very drawn out and painful thing. I think that's so fascinating. Do we know whether the chieftain died in battle? Is there any mention of that? Because I guess that could kind of support that.
Yeah, we don't know actually. He's really not the main character in this story.
Yeah,
I really like the Angel of Death, but she's not the main character either. Really,
it's the
enslaved girl,
the slave girl, which is again it's this. You're taking on another whole other level. She's gone down in immortality. We're stood here, just sat here, talking about her 1,000 years later.
Well done,
and now it's going down onto digital record, so it's going to live on indefinitely.
Yeah,
and that's a fascinating way to kind of.
I mean, speaking from the agency perspective, that was a good move on her end.
It really was, I know.
Yeah, it's a shame we don't know her name. We just put a little name to it. I've never thought of that in a sense of even being able to like manipulate where you go after, because obviously we know that this idea of, or at least we have an idea that there are different halls of where you go once you die. And depending on how you die, maybe where you go or which god or goddess chooses you. And people being people, they will always try to manipulate to go to wherever they want to go to.
Well, won't they?
And I've never this idea has never come to my mind before, that maybe people would try to manipulate the surroundings to get to choose to go to where they wanted to.
Never underestimate the power of human ingenuity / the want to cut corners.
But also, I also like how do you think most people did want to go to Valhalla, or do you think that is like a modern, because it's the cool thing. It's shown in TV shows, it's shown in movies. It's the cool place to go because you get to go and like fight all day and drink
then
mead and all that kind of stuff. You go
all
to
night.
Ragnarok. Yeah, it's very masculine and manly, and it's that thing of like, so that's what's held on to by most people. Most people who, even if you're not into Vikings, you've heard of Valhalla.
Yes.
They're, it's just a cool place. But do you think like they actually really wanted to go there? Do you think they were just happy going to hell or like
Somewhere a bit more chilled.
Freya's Hall? Yeah.
It's a really good question. I also think that when we talk about Valhalla, we need to qualify it with that only half of all dead warriors went there, and it was the second half because Freya had the first pick.
Yes, I was about to say everyone talks about Valhalla. Freaking nobody talks about Folkvangr. Freya has first pick.
She has first pick, and then Odin gets what she doesn't want, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't think everybody did want to go there. I think it's a bit overblown, but clearly, relatively popular. Odin
Maybe
was
they actually wanted to go to Folkvangr.
yeah,
Probably did, yeah.
they did actually, yeah.
Well, if that's if she had the first pick,
Yeah, she did have the first pick.
nobody wants to get picked last in gym class.
No,
It's the same thing. Everybody wants to be, but
The lady has a cart that's drawn by cats. I mean, honestly.
yeah, it's just pretty cool.
She's got style.
She has a war hog. So, I mean,
do we know what her soldiers were for? Do they?
No, we know very little about it because by the time the written sources came along, Odin was. So again, a lot of what I say comes out as very negative to Christianity. By the time the written sources were written, Christianity was in full swing, and the Christians were much more comfortable with a chief male god. So they gave Odin much more space than he probably deserved in the written.
Yeah, I think.
So we don't know much about the other gods.
And I also think it's important to note that by this time, Christianity had also gone through a massive reframing that from being a religion primarily based on peace, it suddenly became like a warriors type religion.
Exactly. So they liked Odin.
Yeah.
Man, violent, awesome. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, let's wrap this up and let people ask you some questions. So basically from this episode, I learned that it's really complicated. You have to define what a human is. You have to define what a sacrifice is.
Yeah.
Maybe they sacrificed humans, maybe they didn't. And it's all just really difficult to define.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Any average conversation with me will leave you thinking, why did I start this conversation?
I think it's important. I think that is a good and important perspective.
I think people need to learn to be uncomfortable in not knowing the answer to things. Everybody wants to know the answer to everything and put everything into neat little boxes, and it doesn't work like that. And I think, as Mag said earlier perfectly, two things can be true, or multiple things, not even just two things. 2, 3, 4 things can all be true at exactly the same time. We focus so much on like a one defined truth, and it doesn't work like that. Things you can have. This can be real, but also this thing can be true over here. And we need to remember that. People just need to be comfortable with it. Like, it's not as easy as saying, yes, they sacrificed to humans. No, they didn't. Because otherwise we couldn't do an hour and a half long show on it either.
It's very, very true. We need to embrace ambiguity. It is important. Sometimes actually knowing the answer ruins the fun as well.
Yeah, the fun is
you don't get to sit around and wonder what was going on.
The fun is in the conversation as well, because if you'd have just come on here and said, yes, the sacrifice to humans, Eber Fanlin did this, that's it. Like that's not, but there's nothing to that, is there? There's no thinking that goes along with that. There's a few times in this episode I've gone, oh my God, that's made me think completely differently when it comes to how humans are perceived or the definition of humans in the Viking Age. Like straight away, that had me thinking. And then with this idea that maybe you can manipulate where you go, like these moments like that, I love that when it comes to this podcast. It makes me go, oh man, I've never thought of it quite like that before. I've done hundreds of hours of this show. So when a moment happens where I'm like, never thought of it from that angle before, that's brilliant. And I'm sure there's so many other people that have that as well.
I hope so.
So cool. I love it.
Yeah, let's wrap this up, and then we will because I've seen tons of questions in the chat,
Right.
So we'll let people ask you some questions. I'm sure I'll have a lot more. So if you do want to hear more from this episode, you can get the Q&A, which we're going to record right after this. And even if you can't get into it live, there is value into listening to it after. And that's over at Patreon/Nordic Mythology Podcast. Starts from £3 a month. Marianne, where can people find you? Do you have a public persona that people can follow, or where people can read your papers, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty easy to find. I don't really do a lot of social media because I'm not very good with them. So that's not the right place. I have an academia profile that I intermittently update. But actually probably the safest place to look is on the Museum of Cultural History's homepages, where my profile is updated because I have to record all the papers I publish, and they are automatically updated on there. So that was a very long way of saying I'm not that good at staying online.
You are reachable. Just make an effort.
Yes. You can find my email address on there, and I am available to contact for questions and chats and anything to do with sacrifice or feminism or death.
There we go. That was, that was very open-ended there. Just death. Anything death.
Just death.
Why
The concept of
I
death.
know there is just something. It's that morbid curiosity, isn't it? It really gets me. Mags, where can people find you?
Well, I'm not super active on social media either, but if there is anyone that wants to follow me, when I do post something once in a blue moon, the place to find me is on Instagram, which is Archeomags, Archeo with a K.
Perfect. For me, it's Daniel_Farrand1 or Horns of Odin, and then just Nordic Mythology Podcast across the board. And if you'd like to see all our faces, YouTube, hit the little like and subscribe button, the little bell. We put all episodes on there. There's always some value to the visual aspect. Sometimes people hold things up, or it's just nice to see people talking, I guess. Yeah, that's it. Let's wrap this up.